You are a piece of excuse for a bird.
Oh yeah, I'm a piece of shit.
But it's not your fault.
It's not my fault.
Society at large is feminizing male birds in general. It's all part of their plan.
Part of their plan.
But if you subscribe to everything I tell you, you will overcome this degeneracy and find glory in your life. Hey.
Whoa, what the f?
You have been groomed.
Who?
Shh. It's okay. Really. It happens. But we need to talk about it because you're only 14 years old and there's something very wrong about this. By the end of this video, we hope you can find a way to love yourself.
But it's true. Birds are becoming feminized. Look at all this decadence. Society needs real men in order to function. And
listen, you piece of shit. Hey. Listen, you piece of shit. The entire shtick that masculinity is in crisis is a key selling point of a market that profits off of your insecurity. Every generation thinks the next generation is spoiled, lazy, decadent, and in need of toughening up. But a point to remember is that the generation prior to theirs also thought that they were spoiled, lazy, decadent, and in need of toughening up. (2020). In the West, the steady feminization of our men at the same time that Marxism is being taught to our children is no coincidence. It's an outright attack. Bring back manly men. 2004. Today's men, particularly young men, are embracing their feminine side, experts say. They're seeking sleek electronics, the right face cream, and an honest manicurist. It's a social evolution. 1984. I am an older woman, and I believe in equal rights and all, but don't you think all this women's lip stuff has contributed to the wimping of the American male? Am I just imagining it, or is today's man less manly than those I grew up with? A strong woman should be for a strong man. 1977. Living in high-rise apartment buildings helps make men effeminate. A man with no garden to dig or the opportunity to carry out masculine activities becomes passive and effeminate. 1965. Men are increasingly avoiding their responsibilities nowadays with an increasing use of toiletries, long hair, and dandified clothes. 1950. We men are getting feminine. I can't entirely stomach the idea either, but it seems to be true. Some research guys looking into men's masculine-feminine ratios tell us we're losing our masculinity and gaining femininity. 1940. Raw meat diet. At the meeting of the American Medical Association, a speaker maintained that people are getting less vigorous, the men more feminine and the women more masculine, because we don't eat raw meat. 1934. Women imitating men have caused men to become less chivalrous. Too much feminine influence early in life is having a serious impact on men. 1925. Men becoming effeminate. New York physician says they are, and cites lilac pajamas as proof. 1922. Men becoming feminine, using too much makeup. 1920. Growing weakness on the part of the men of the country is developing a sinister feminism. 1910. If the American woman persists in her undue athletic sports, there will soon be little difference between the masculine and the feminine. 1902. I notice a certain style among young men in almost every locality. A style so repulsive and weak so to shock the intelligence of refined people. The hateful style of parting hair in the middle. My observation is that 9 young men out of every 10 who part their hair in the middle are useless to the church and worthless to society. In your mind, it's now that things are f***ed, while in the past all men looked like this. Newsflash, they didn't. And they themselves thought, just like you, that all men of the past looked like this. They didn't. And they themselves thought, and that's just how it goes. Masculinity is always defined by an absence that haunts its presence. It sounds spooky, but it really isn't. Everything you're hearing now has been said before using the technologies of that particular context. Some people get rich off of this hustle. You think you've discovered the truth as opposed to the sheep that surround you, all the while being haunted by all the previous generation's baggage, which are then projected onto the next generation, and the cycle of violence continues to yourself and everyone around you. کافر همه را به کیش خود پندارد. The sinner sees everyone else tainted in their sins. See these muftis with beards down to their chest. Let me tell you something about these guys. If you ever hear someone ranting off about decadent times, I guarantee you that they themselves get up to some of the most ratchet shit you could ever conceive of. The only thing these pricks don't do is eat pork. Why do you think they keep repeating the line, only Allah can judge me? Because there's a shitload there to judge. The more guilty they feel about doing something, the more they project it onto others and condemn a whole society for it. The sinner sees everyone tainted in their sins. Let's take the US as an example. In the mid-19th century, the US was still primarily a rural society, with just over 15% of the population classed as urban in the 1850 census. By the beginning of the 1870s, however, this figure had climbed to nearly 21%, reaching almost 46% by 1910. As a result, a new organization of towns and cities began to become more visible. Sociologists point out that during this development, what was conceptualized as a family began to shrink significantly. What we see today as the nuclear family, where the father is the breadwinner, is historically a novel phenomenon. It's very new. And this image is then passed down in our imagination of how people organized in previous centuries. From here, the creation of a distinctive identity around domestic values and family practices began to emerge. Central to this new model of family organization were systems of gender relations in which the home became a site of separate spheres. Subordinate was the feminine domain of the private, idealized family life. Women's identities oriented primarily around a cult of domesticity, in which they became the maternal guardians of the family. More dominant was the sphere of the masculine public, where masculine identities, through their occupational and civic activities, provided for a household of dependents. Hence, the late 19th century represented a moment of social, economic, and cultural changes that transformed the dominant notions of masculinity and femininity, influencing the way we view bodies, identities, autonomy, and status. Interestingly, these changes also brought about a drop in the annual birth rates. Between the 1800s and 1900s, the rates dropped by 40%. The decline, especially pronounced amongst white native-born Protestants, prompted eugenicist fears of racial suicide. Cough, cough. More prevalent, however, was the drive for a reassertion of manly qualities in response to the perceived feminization of traditional masculine ideals. In 1902, you hear that? 1902, a host of publications began trending amongst men who were looking to reclaim traits of toughness and aggressive sexuality. This was also echoed in the political sphere, where President Roosevelt denounced the soft spirit of the age, insisting on the need for a return to the doctrine of a more strenuous life. Until the early 20th century, production rather than consumption was considered for the most part to be the legitimate focus of a man's energy. But between the 1940s and 1980s, post-war Western capitalist economies saw power and profits increasingly dependent not simply on the production of goods, but also on the continual regeneration of consumer desires. To sustain its survival, this new economic order demanded commodity consumption and judged people by their lifestyle as much as their capacity for production. These were the boom times. In place of the traditional morality of duty, the French philosopher and sociologist Bourdieu contends that the new petit bourgeois increasingly elaborated for a new morality of pleasure, in which it became a failure to self-esteem to not have fun, and a lack of ability to compete in consumption produced feelings of emasculation. Consumption became the name of the game. The reconfiguration of labor markets, the transformation of gender relations, and the rise of mass consumption together unhinged many of the traditional certainties that had been at the heart of dominant conceptions of manhood. Within this discourse, the suburban family was promoted as consumer capitalism's brightest beacon. Marcuse saw consumer culture as an elaborate system of indoctrination. For him, contemporary America represented a time of capitalist manipulation, a one-dimensional society where people's consumer obsessions rendered them oblivious to their exploitation. While for women, this role was firmly located in the home, where consumption meant TVs, refrigerators, and sofas, women's increased participation in the labor force was viewed with growing ambivalence. Women's greater sexual independence, meanwhile, was often interpreted as a challenge to traditional gender role. And in the mid-20th century, an all-out attack on female autonomy was underway in the fields of psychology and psychiatry. Cough. The Modern Woman, The Lost Sex was a 1947 bestseller, and according to this book, female sexuality was receptivity and passiveness, a willingness to accept dependence without fear or resentment, with a deep inwardness and readiness for the final goal of sexual life, impregnation. And those who failed to conform to this ideal were pathologized as the array of the sick, unhappy, and neurotic, who were wholly or partly incapable of dealing with life. Importantly, a refusal or inability to adjust to the homemaker role could result in women being labeled neurotic or schizophrenic, a diagnosis which sometimes led to electroshock therapy or institutionalization. Meanwhile, literature was rife for men to conform to a particular trend of masculinity, a form of masculinity which would have been laughed at just a few decades prior.
I think I get what you're saying, but do you own a private jet?
No, we're literally birds. We can just...
Well then, you have nothing to teach me here.